Please hold. Thank you.
Province's police watchdogs changing the way public complaints are handled. But this announcement is also symbolic. The government tapping into the deepest, most difficult aspect of this social contract society has with police officers: trust. At times, it seems two sides simply glowering at each other, everyone agreeing that police, who do have the responsibility to carry guns, must be held to the highest scrutiny. How people interpret that scrutiny, what is reasonable, what is too harsh, what is too lenient, this is where things break down. The previous Liberal government appointed a judge to look into 3 civilian oversight bodies. This comprehensive review was sparked by the case of Andrew Loku, a black father in Toronto. He had 5 children. He had mental health issues. He was holding a hammer in an apartment building when police shot and killed him. In this hour, we will analyze what the Ford government is actually reversing and what it is keeping the same. We have 2 guests, a lawyer who has represented clients who have sued police, and a former detective who has researched how negative attitudes about police affects police work. We're going to ask you if any of these changes make sense or nudge you in a different direction. And please do call if you are in policing. If you're an officer, it would be lousy to go through a whole hour and not hear from those of you who do the job. This is our toll-free number, 1-888-817-8995.
If a police officer tries to stop a suicide attempt but is unsuccessful, he or she is treated like a suspect. If a police officer is on the scene of a crime when someone else on the scene suffers a heart attack, then they are treated like a suspect, even if there is no contact between the police officer and the heart attack victim. If a police officer responds to a violent crime, tries to perform CPR, but is unable to save the life, he or she is treated like a suspect.
That again is more from that news conference. Caroline Mulrooney was the Attorney General. We actually contacted 3 officials in Sylvia Jones's office, so she's the other minister, yesterday morning to invite her to join us. She is the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services. We never got any reply, but no matter. We have 2 very thoughtful, insightful guests joining us. I'm going to start with Davin Charney, a lawyer in Toronto who focuses on police complaints and lawsuits. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
What was the thing, from your perspective, that the previous government was trying to address?
Well, they were trying to address the upswell in the public that was and momentum that had been built to change the way that policing is done in the province. And it's important to contextualize the legislation.
Hi there, what's your name, please?
My name is Dion Renee.
And Dion, where are you calling from?
Toronto.
Okay. And have you had sort of a chance to look at the changes the government has announced?
Where can you find those changes? Because they're very difficult to locate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will tweet them out. It's 300 pieces of it's 300 pages of legislation.
I even went to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and I can't find it there.
Okay, I'll tweet it out. Have you read some of the coverage? Is it they're
Yes.
So what did you want to say?
Well, I first want to hear what you all are saying, and then
okay. Well, why don't I put you on hold then, and I'll come circle back, and then
no.
What you want to
Trust
say.
me, you want to talk to me. I'm actually a person who has been involved with the SIU, and
okay. In what way?
Tony Loparco is afraid of me for some reason. He's not responded to me. And even Irwin, I don't know if the ministers have changed, but the ministry involved in overseeing the SIU, which is the Agency and Tribunals section of the Attorney General's office, they said they're trying to reach him, and he's elusive. I believe the director of the SIU has a responsibility to respond to any of the reports he issues, and he fails to...
Sorry, Dion, I can't have a long conversation. Hold on for a second.
Okay, sure.
You're going into a lot of detail that I can't actually follow.
I thought you asked me a question about that.
Civilian oversight, where civilian investigators would conduct investigations into alleged police misconduct. So that's the biggest change.
So let me help myself to also the audience. This is the public complaint. So it's not when there's a discharge of a firearm. This is about kind of other comportment, and it was going to be looked at by civilians, not police.
That's right. And I mean, it could be the situation you've described where there's a firearm discharged. So the distinction between the two bodies that I've mentioned, the Special Investigations Unit investigates alleged criminal misconduct. The Public Complaints System investigates alleged misconduct under the Police Services Act. That's the legislation in Ontario that governs policing. And there's a list of misconducts outlined in that legislation that would include things such as excessive use of force or discreditable conduct and such. And so when you make a complaint, what's investigated is offenses under the Police Services Act, not criminal wrongdoing. That's left to the Special Investigations Unit.
You know, I probably knew that somewhere along the way, but this idea of whenever there's a firearm in use, whether there's a fatality or an injury, that's how I always interpreted, or I think it gets presented even in the media space, of when the Special Investigations Unit is called in. But you talked about whether there's criminal activity.
That's right. And in fact, you'd mentioned the discharge of a firearm. Under the previous legislation, there was no requirement if a police officer used a firearm to notify the Special Investigations Unit. There was only the requirement if a person was hit with a bullet and injured, that would invoke the mandate of the Special Investigations Unit. And actually, there was a recent case in the Toronto Star of Sanchian Rajasigam, who was shot at by a police officer who missed, and the Special Investigations Unit was not notified.
Okay, so the change is what then? This proposed change?
So one of the significant changes that the current government is actually going to keep, which was cut and paste from the Liberal legislation, is that the Special Investigations Unit, that there's a list of when police have to notify the Special Investigations Unit. So it's clarified when they're in the legislation when their mandate is invoked. For example, if a person is hospitalized as a result of an interaction with police, the Special Investigations Unit must be informed now in the proposed legislation. Previously, a person could be hospitalized and the police at the scene could decide this is not a serious injury, and they could fail to notify the Special Investigations Unit. So that was one of the progressive changes that the Liberals brought in, and it's one of the changes that the current government is going to keep in the proposed legislation.
Okay, that's a little bit of what you didn't like, but you're also acknowledging what's not changing. So what do you make of them when you heard the ministers? Because it's clear sort of some of the intent, at least, in speaking, that they want police to feel that they're trusted.
Absolutely. So, Carolyn Mulrooney is a politician, and I think we're just hearing political speak and trying to appease a certain base of that would include police officers and others that are vehemently in support of police. So really, I think she's just speaking to that. The suggestion that the previous Liberal government was anti-police, frankly, I would suggest is not true, because the previous government was in power for 16 years and did nothing to change policing in a progressive way until the very end of their mandate. And also the legislation that the government is now proposing, at least in part, in regards to the Special Investigations Unit, is largely just cut and paste from the Liberal legislation.
And when you're saying cut and paste, I mean, it's your way of saying they didn't change anything. Okay, I want to bring in our other guest, Greg Brown. He spent 28 years with the Ottawa Police Service as a homicide detective, undercover drug enforcement officer. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto. He's interviewed thousands of frontline officers and asked about, I guess, the way they feel about negative attitudes toward policing. He also acts as a consultant, and perhaps this is why you're joining us from Mexico. Hello.
Good afternoon, Rita. Pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Is it work or pleasure? I guess it doesn't really matter, but we're pleased you're here. How do you read this announcement this week from the provincial government?
Sure. I guess one of the concerns related to the introduction to the show was around the social contract, and I think a lot of people have neglected that there's two constituents as parties to that contract. Much is made about the public half of that relationship, but very little attention is directed towards the other half, which is the police officers themselves. And I conducted a very large research study that involved 3,660 frontline officers at 23 different police departments. And there was an unmistakable concern amongst frontline officers about the tone of the relationship today, vis-a-vis sort of the techno-social aspects, the increased video recording of police, the dissemination of those videos with a narrative accompanying the person's perspective on what they're watching, and then a pronounced shift in sort of the socio-political tenor in all various jurisdictions, not only in Ontario, but across Canada and across the United States, that police officers are perceiving, whether they're right or wrong in their perception is really irrelevant in my estimation, but they're certainly perceiving a very anti-police agenda amongst broad aspects of the citizenry and the media, and that's really having a fundamental impact on how police officers are doing their work.
In what ways?
So we've had
what practical way does that actually play out, that if you've been able to quantify it?
Of course, yeah. So we've shifted over the last 50 years to what we would suggest is a community-based policing model, where we're expecting the police to interact with the community. We're expecting the police to do more than just respond to calls for service. We expect them to be proactive in their work. And so given those two phenomena that I discussed a minute ago, officers are really retreating from proactive engagement. They're saying to me in a very unmistakable way that they're not inclined to do those kind of proactive jobs. They're inclined more to just do the bare minimum, to react to calls that they're dispatched to, because they suggest that doing otherwise exposes them to a risk that they're not willing to take, risk of a complaint, a risk of a use of force interaction that really in their job description, it's kind of challenging to say, but it's the truth, in their job description, that's really optional police conduct.
What kind of
There's
percentage?
really no way to measure that.
Okay, 80%, 90%, 40%?
70% of officers of that large sample size, 70% of officers are practicing depolicing.
And you
some
talked
form of depolicing.
And you talked to Canadian police officers?
I did. 2,850 Canadian police officers all across the country from 18 different police services.
Okay.
So the results are very compelling.
Well, and I mean, people might read this in many different ways. I'll give you the telephone number again: 1-888-817-8995. I'll park it there just for a second, because also, when it comes to this announcement, then what, if anything, is jumping out at you?
Sure. I mean, I've gone through the bill, not in detail, but I have some initial thoughts. I think officers are going to be very pleased with the 120-day limitation on investigations. The previous situation, I mean, it was brought to my attention by thousands of police officers that found it.
Dion, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. So with respect to this legislation, the provincial government is, what do you like or not like about it? Just sort of a headline. I can't go into a whole lot of detail.
No, you would ask me a question, and that's why I answered it. The purpose of my call is as an advocate dealing with issues surrounding SIU and very involved with it. And the concern that I have, I'm not even sure who you have as the second person speaking. He sounds like he's an American, and doesn't.
No, they're both Canadians. One is with the Ottawa police, or former Ottawa police officer, and the other one is a Toronto lawyer.
So, no, I know, Mr. Charney. The issue I have is I'm trying to listen to the program at the same time while I'm on hold, trying to see where it is that you're directing things and the comments that are being made, and that's where I would be directing my comments to. But based on the second individual who is more pro-police, and it's not to say that people are not pro-police, but the fact of the matter is if you change legislation to support an institution, that is the problem. Legislation is there in order to protect the public's rights and interests. An institution is there to uphold its duties and responsibilities, not to escape accountability.
Right. Okay. I get where you're going. I'll hold you there. I'll try to get to you very shortly. Okay. And did you yourself have a dispute with, or have a complaint that was?
I guess you don't know who I am.
Investigated by the SIU.
Yeah, I guess you don't know who I am. I certainly tweet about it all the time, and I'm not hearing.
I'm sorry. What? I don't know your last name. What is your last name?
Sorry, I said Dion Renee.
Renee, I apologize. Okay.
That's okay.
Sorry, Dan. I'll try to get to you very shortly. Okay, don't go away, please.
I think it is time for real civilian oversight of the police because, considering the strange and unspeakable thing that happened to my family, where my husband died as a result of a cardiac arrest that he had in front of police headquarters, there was no SIU investigation, even though there were 3 officers at the scene, because for the first 5 months afterwards, I had no reason to know that there were 3 officers on the scene. It wasn't until I was able to get the 911 call, which there had been an effort made to suppress, apparently, according to EMS, that I found out that there had been 3 officers on the scene.
Maria, can I just back you up for a second? Because you've jumped into a story that none of us know, and I'm sorry about your husband. Like, what happened that day? Why was he in front of a police station? What was going on?
Well, he was presumably walking past the building. It wasn't the station, it was the 40 College Street, and he was on his way to a gardening convention that was taking place at the Courtyard Marriott Hotel on Yonge Street. And I had said goodbye to him about 15 minutes before this started to happen at Bay and Dundas. And he was going to set up our table for the event. He went into cardiac arrest. They found him on the bench in front of Toronto Police Headquarters. None of the officers on the scene made a 911 call, but one of them went into the building to ask somebody else in the building to make a 911 call to come and have this. Basically, it was about removing this person, the street person, as they described him, who had died in front of the headquarters building. And then I got all kinds of confusing information from them about whether or not he was, all the investigations that followed. Was he really dead when they found him? Wasn't he dead? There was a defibrillator. Nobody used the defibrillator. People all had CPR, but nobody attempted it. And then they denied being there. And that's the part that became, to me, the real problem, because even if they hadn't known how to save his life, or even if his life couldn't have been saved, how can you say you're not at the scene when somebody dies? It's like, what possible reason would a person have for denying their presence at something like that? So, I mean, he was just a person walking by who sat down when he wasn't feeling well and went into cardiac arrest. And why would they deny being there? So, I mean, we're getting a sense of you're shocked, you're lost, confusion about getting a straight answer, and you were interviewed by Justice Tulloch apparently about this. At some point, yes, during that long investigation, he spoke to many people, maybe about 1,500 people, and I went to some of the sessions. So was there ever the Special Investigations Unit or... No, they were never involved. I didn't even realize that they should have been involved if that was the case. Well, I'm not sure that's clear. Because I always associated them with shootings and things like that. I didn't even know there was a problem at first, right? I mean, I'd like our guest to weigh in. Maybe, should we start with you, Davin Charney? What are you thinking of when you're hearing Maria's story?
The thing that strikes me, and this gets at bigger issues of policing, moves a little bit away from the topic of police oversight, but the attitude of police that this is a street person. There are, unfortunately, and this is not unique to policing, but negative attitudes in policing. We've heard a lot about, in the media, about police racism and discrimination towards the Black community, towards Indigenous communities. So that's the thing that sort of strikes me, from Maria's story. The other thing is that in her quest for answers, there appeared to be a great lack of transparency. Now, we've seen in the U.S. with the number of high-profile shootings and incidents with police involvement that the very next day, the police department will release video footage from the police officer's car or from the cell area at a police station. But in Canada, there is absolute silence. Your guest, Greg Brown, had mentioned that the Special Investigations Unit can take 18 months to 2 years to conduct their investigations. The families of people who have been killed by police will wait that time. They will know absolutely nothing, and I appreciate that length of that investigation is not comfortable for police officers, but it's also extremely difficult for the families because there is absolutely no transparency. They know absolutely nothing, and it used to be that the SIU could make their decisions and not release any information at all to the families. So there's a lack of transparency in the system.
It's better now?
It's better now because the previous Liberal government mandated that the Special Investigations Unit was required to release reports whenever they make a decision.
And that should still stay?
That should stay, and it's in the current proposed legislation.
Greg Brown, when you hear Maria, what a sad and unfortunate story, too. As a former police, what are you hearing there? Thinking, okay, obviously something didn't go right.
For sure, and Maria, I'm very sorry for your loss. Without knowing the specifics of the incident, I don't really feel comfortable in addressing it directly. I mean, I would find it abhorrent if a police officer intentionally neglected somebody in medical distress. To Davin's point, I think that there is some encouraging aspects to the new legislation, and he referenced one. I was focusing more on the police officers, but he's absolutely correct. I mean, certainly for families of persons involved in these kind of interactions with police, having the 120-day resolution limit will be very beneficial for them. I'm also encouraged by Section 29 in the proposed bill that talks about public statements by the SIU director. Director Loparco and I have had conversation about this. I presented a lot of conferences on police oversight, and we've talked about this. And I'm hoping that if I read this correctly, it's going to remove this blanket prohibition on any kind of comment, because quite often, as Davin suggested, these incidents are captured by video, and that's released through media outlets. So the public is watching a video, they're interpreting the video, and the SIU director or the police are left with, no comment. I'm not allowed to comment.
Right, and then they make their decisions based on that. Listen, we're pausing for some local news and weather, and when we come back, we'll continue with your calls. You're listening to Ontario Today.
This is a CBC News Update. It's 12:30 and 2 degrees with light snow in Ottawa. I'm Lawrence Wall from the CBC Ottawa newsroom. Ontario's police watchdog will not be laying charges after a high-speed chase last March ended with the death of an 88-year-old woman east of Napanee. The SIU says OPP were justified in chasing after the SUV as it traveled at 140 kilometers an hour and more. The 42-year-old driver is facing several charges, including first-degree murder. Police say a man accused of killing his 11-year-old daughter has died in hospital. Raj Kumar died yesterday after spending days in hospital with what they described as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His daughter, Ria Raj Kumar, became the subject of an Amber Alert last week. And Venezuela's president is ordering the border with Brazil closed as opposition leaders plan to bring in foreign humanitarian aid. More news at 1.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian Black. Here's the forecast for Ottawa. Cloudy, 40% chance of flurries. West wind picking up, 30 to 50, a high of 1 degree. Tonight, mainly cloudy and evening flurry, then clearing. Winds drop off, a low of -12. Tomorrow, sunshine, then becoming a mix of sun and cloud, a high of -1. Saturday, increasing cloudiness, a high near 0. Saturday night, periods of freezing rain or snow. Sunday, periods of freezing rain or rain, the high near 3.
You're listening to Ontario Today. I'm Rita Celli.
The previous government looked at our police officers, and all it apparently saw were potential offenders. And worst of all, the previous government codified that suspicion into law.
Ontario's Attorney General Caroline Mulrooney announcing changes to how police are investigated.
This erosion of trust was unforgivable. Many frontline officers have spoken to me about trust, and how it is the most fundamental component of effective policing. Unfortunately, the Liberals sought to break that trust by treating police officers as the subject of suspicion and scorn.
This is Sylvia Jones, the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services. We're looking at the changes the government is proposing to police oversight. Is it on the right track? Will it improve trust between police and the public? 1-888-817-8995. Our Twitter handle is @CBC Ontario Today.
We've made no changes. We have never supported police stops that are based on race, and we will continue to support that. We are not bringing back street checks in the province of Ontario.
That's Sylvia Jones answering a question about carding, and that was her answer to reporters on Tuesday. We have two guests again, Davin Charney, a lawyer in Toronto, and Greg Brown, who is retired, not retired as a police officer, homicide detective, but working in the field of research. And he started out the show by telling us of some of his research about negative attitudes towards police officers. Chris, where are you calling us from?
From the province of Ontario.
Well, that narrows it down.
There's a lot of snow where I'm from.
Oh, that even narrows it down more. You don't want to be totally identified, perhaps?
No, absolutely not. That's why I'm sure that you probably won't hear from a lot of cops because of the the potential repercussions that come with saying anything nowadays.
Fair enough. So I take it you are a police officer?
Yeah, for 27 years.
Okay. So, did you go and read the file?
I'm currently off with a diagnosis of PTSD, and haven't worked in a couple of years. But I don't really want to get into my situation at this point. But I just wanted to kind of comment on the sheer incompetence of the SIU and what the officers have to deal with. I want to give a very quick example of. Sorry, I'm a little nervous, so
okay.
I may not be as articulate as I want to be, but. I'll give you an example of an officer in the province who is now as well off with PTSD. And actually, it was his line. He said, it's like we're walking a tightrope with no net underneath anymore. Like there's nothing there. We're all alone. So this guy responds to a call, and this is within the past year and a half. In a metropolitan area, there's a guy with a rifle and an Iraqi flag on his head, and he was being violent or he was being aggressive and acting strange with a rifle. This is during the day. This is how the call comes in, and I may not be exact on the specifics, but it's very referenceable. So this officer responds full tilt because it's a mall. This is a huge call. Something comes in that it looks like it's a sword on his back, and he's as soon as the officer gets there, he tells him to stop. The guy starts running towards a Tim Hortons, I believe, a crowded area. The officer runs after him. Okay, is communicating over his radio to the dispatchers that the guy's running away. This is a situation where he could have pulled his gun out. He could have used a lot of different options. He ran up to the guy, gave him several knee strikes, handcuffed him, helped him to his feet, found out that what was in the bag was not a rifle or a sword, but an umbrella or something disguised as it. It looked like a weapon. It was made to be looked like a replica weapon. Anyway, so what I consider that is an extreme act of bravery with the least use of force possible used. He was investigated, put off or suspended, I believe. And the guy claimed to have broken ribs from the knee strikes. That's it. But this offender at this point had been charged previously with stabbing someone. I think he had mental health issues, and that's not really, we can't assess that, and we can't make that decision at the time. So anyway, this officer is now off with PTSD. He was cleared, but they came after him internally in the police service. They've gone after him for little minor things since. Like, it's just been unbelievable. And he had previously been involved in a lawsuit with his organization at one for racial profiling. This is a brown guy I'm talking about. So anyway, this is what we're dealing with. I could go on and on and on and on, but I can't because you got to get other people on the show.
Well, what I want to ask you, then, I guess, because there's a million ways to go, and partly, I've embedded, the guests who are with me today are to help all of us understand the nuances of the changes, because, the bigger picture, this idea of trust or anti-police, this is the stuff where people can go quite quickly, and you did too, right?
It's a huge movement.
So what do you...
It's a huge movement. The police aren't allowed in the gay pride parades anymore.
Oh, my goodness. Come on, get on with it already.
We're fully marginalized, police officers.
Oh, give me a break.
If you're a family, you're a relative, you might, know a nice cop, but most people don't like the police. Simple as that, and that's the attitude, and they love to see us go down. For doing our jobs that they wouldn't do.
So if you hear these ministers talking, these female ministers talking about, correcting things, do you think that overall that would make the public feel more to trust police, or does it sound too political?
Well, I think we need to garner a lot more trust with the public. The police need to be the public, and the public need to be the police. And that was way back in my police college in 1992. I think Greg Brown would probably know who it's like. We are the public, and we need more trust. We need full transparency. And let's face it, we all know there's videotape. Everything that's done now, everyone. I was a supervisor, and always, it's like, guys, there's cell phones. Like, act appropriately, and it's been like that for a long time now, and it really has changed and probably corrected a lot of police actions. I'm not saying we're perfect, but
I was just going to ask you, actually,
really tough job.
Before we go to Greg Brown, I'm just curious because frankly, even in my studio, I'm being recorded right now. I'm curious from you, then, because you're obviously, we can hear how protective you feel and kind of put down. But do you sometimes, when you then hear about an officer who has done something wrong, do you feel like you really let down because that one incident might reinforce negative stereotypes?
No. I mean, depending on what the officer's done, the officers are humans too. If
something really boneheaded, if it's really dumb, and something that you rolling your eyes and saying,
blatant, of course. And if it's completely wrong, and there's malfeasance, or it's just, of course, it makes us all feel shitty.
Well, I'm asking because everyone's like that. I think in their profession or even their gender, you want to feel like you're fighting a good cause. But anyway, Greg Brown, what are you hearing in Chris's call? Because presumably this is not news to you to hear an officer speak like that.
No. I mean, this is very, very common. And like Chris, I was a supervisor myself of a frontline platoon, and I told my officers essentially the same thing. I mean, police officers have to use force when they're interacting with someone who is not happy about being taken off to jail. We can try all the de-escalation that we want and the negotiation, but at the end of the day, if a person doesn't want to go, you have to rely on force to force them to do that. And so things have changed, especially with video recording. And so I explained in sort of common lay terms to my officers, the day of being the fourth person flying off the top rope like on the WWF wrestling, that cannot happen today. You'll be on video and you'll be in prison and you'll lose your job. And so things have changed substantially. The second thought I had is around what I was mentioning before the break, this Section 29 in the new legislation around public statements by the new complaints director and or by the director of the SIU. And I think that would be a very beneficial situation. So imagine a situation where we have a police, the caller mentioning this occurrence. So we have a video recording of this event. The public gets it. Everybody's left to their own interpretations. And I think Davin, as a lawyer, would agree with me that the law around police use of force is very nuanced, but the public doesn't quite understand that. So it would be very beneficial to put some context around that. So maybe a statement by an official saying, these are the laws that apply to police use of force. This is the Ontario Police Use of Force Framework. We actually have that. It's available on the internet. So the public kind of understands, okay, this is the circumstances the officer encountered. This is the subject behavior. This is what the officer is lawfully allowed to do. It might provide a little more context and stop these kind of wildly speculative.
Davin Charney, do you want to weigh in for a second?
Sure. I found it interesting that the caller mentioned and takes the perspective that the police are marginalized. And I've heard this before from other officers. For example, the Hamilton Police, a number of years ago in their hate crimes report, they included hate crimes against the police as in one of the sections. So the police, I think, take the viewpoint that they're a persecuted minority, but the reality really is that they're a very powerful and privileged minority that has a lot of public resources behind them and sophisticated lawyers and such to protect them. The other thing the caller mentioned, he used the expression that policing is a tough job. I absolutely agree, policing is a tough job, and what often happens when people are critical of the police, they forget that police themselves are only one of the institutions that are responsible for policing. The government is responsible, or should be responsible, for training and recruitment. This is one of the fundamental problems in Ontario, is that the government is failing in their responsibility to direct police with proper training and how to recruit.
You've mentioned it a few times, so even that comprehensive thing that the Liberals did you like some of it? Even the second time you raised training and recruiting, what's missing from your perspective?
So the Liberal legislation didn't touch at all on training and recruitment, and so their legislation was dealing with oversight. So if we're concerned about policing or bad policing, yes, we want to have proper oversight, we want to have accountability, but we want to get at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is, how are police officers trained? Who is being recruited as a police officer? It may shock your viewers to learn that in Ontario, you can graduate from high school, get hired on by a police force, do 3 months of training at the police college, and be walking the streets with a gun and a badge. Is
that still happening? I guess I believe that from 30 years ago, maybe, but that my impression now is that, yes, in theory that can happen, but it's really tough to get into police forces, and you got to put something on the table.
It's happening less and less. Most have a degree, or 1 or 2 year degree from a private college. But one of the things that Justice DeLocke, and he was appointed by the previous government to do an investigation on police oversight bodies, his final recommendation was that in Ontario the government should investigate the possibility of creating a degree program for police, so that police should be required to go to university like other professions, and then they would be more highly trained, more sophisticated. Policing is a tough job. Greg mentioned that there's a lot of nuances in the law around the use of force. Me as a lawyer, in order to understand the law and go to court and argue the law, I have to have 2 years minimum of university education, then 3 years of a law degree, and then a year of articling. Well, police, as a minimum, are required 3 months of education at the police college, and then they're out on the streets enforcing the law. So that's the situation that is the underlying everything that's leading to a lot of problems that we see with police.
I'm going to go back to the phones. Andrew, you're in Kanata. I'm not even sure what I'm asking anymore, because there's some of these changes that this government wants to bring in. At the heart of it, the idea of trying to improve the relationship and trust between police and the public. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, Rita. I'm not a police hater. I think they have a very tough job, and they deal with some of the worst, aspects of society, and they're sort of dealing with all the problems, whether they're criminal or not. But you know what? Police volunteer to go into that job.
That's right.
And they're very well paid for it. And I find it very interesting that Doug Ford's, has chosen, they're just swinging the pendulum the opposite way to Liberals, and I think it's out of an ideologue position. The minister was talking about how most police officers are viewed as potential offenders. Well, that is not true at all, and that's just hyperbole from the Doug Ford conservative, and appealing to their base. The one interesting thing that they said was...
Can I just jump in for a second? There may be, I think, somewhere on the spectrum, people who do feel that way, but Andrew, you're saying there's sort of what? That you believe there's more of a big middle of people where they might raise an eyebrow and certainly want the scrutiny, but wouldn't go as far as, saying every cop is a walking criminal.
Well, exactly. I don't think most people think most police officers are probably are hardworking and diligent about their job, but there is a distinct and obviously it becomes a very public view when police officers go bad. It's big news, and the interesting thing that one of the ministers said was talking about trust being the most important part of policing, and they're saying that by gutting the previous bill, that's going to increase trust, and I frankly don't think that for a minute. And I just, there's so many examples.
I want to ask you something, because you're out there that you're feeling still that there's a lack of accountability to the public. I'm curious because you're calling from the Ottawa area. There's something in the local news in that part of the province where the SIU has cleared any wrongdoing, and it's a case where an 88-year-old woman was killed during a police chase. She was collateral, her vehicle. So, you and I, listeners, don't necessarily know all the details, but, that's the kind of case where, depending on one's lens or bias, they will interpret that a certain way, right? So what a terrible story, right? This elderly lady still driving, doing her own thing on that day, and she's caught in this police chase, and it's just what it is. There's nobody really accountable. Does that bother you?
Well, of course it bothers me. Sometimes life circumstances are horrible, right? And, maybe there wasn't any fault on the police officer's part. I don't know the specifics of the case, so I can't comment on that. But I will say, can I bring up one example, though? And the example I bring up is of Robert Jakansky in the Vancouver airport, and that was probably, I'm not sure, 10 years ago. But you see, the thing that undermines police officers more than anything is when they behave badly and then there is some sort of attempt at covering it up. And had there not been a videotape of what that encounter, what happened at that encounter, I'm sure no one in this country would ever have heard of Robert Jakansky. And it was only after that videotape was made public, then all of a sudden the questions started getting asked. And that the police officers, and I'm not sure in the end, I think only a couple were acquitted and a couple were convicted. But
it's good. Yeah, there's awful long twists in that. But you're right to point out, and some officers held accountable, and there's a legacy for all of them. Maybe a quick comment from you, Greg Brown, because you did bring up the idea of the surveillance, and for a lot of people like our caller, that's a good thing because it's actually pumped up the kind of accountability and even public conversations that people are having.
Absolutely, and that was one of the more interesting findings as I interacted with police officers. Very few had any objection to being held accountable. Very few had any objection to being video recorded. In fact, many officers who participated in body camera pilots wanted their cameras back. When those pilots ended, they actually, Mike Barsky, who's a superintendent with Toronto Police, explained to me that the Toronto Police body cam pilot, when it was over and the cameras were returned, many of those officers said, I want my camera back. So officers aren't trying to avoid accountability or video recording, but they would like some context around it, which is where I think we were discussing earlier. It certainly will. I think the earlier caller, Chris, mentioned that there is a deterrent component there, and I'm certainly not going to suggest that every single police officer out of the 65,000 across Canada are perfect. We do have certainly bad.
Well, do you like the idea that our the other guest raised about just better training, like actually having a degree program for police officers?
I would 100% support that, and I suggest there'd be very little resistance in policing to that. I mean, I teach at Carleton University. I think we should have a degree program in policing, very much like nursing, law, medicine. Bring it in. I mean, the reality, I didn't get a chance to weigh in earlier, but the reality is that police officers aren't being hired like I was when I was 20 years old. Nowadays, police officers are generally in their late 20s, early 30s. They have a lot of life experience. Very few would be hired with anything less than a university degree.
Okay, let's go back to this
Section 83 of the new law talks a lot about additional training, so de-escalation training around the diverse, multiracial, and multicultural character of Ontario society, the rights and cultures of First Nations, Inuit.
Okay, I'm going to hold you there just because I would like to get in a couple of other callers before we wrap up. Steve, you're next. Where are you calling us from?
Bobcaygeon.
Okay, so what did you want to, this idea of trust between public and police, where do you find yourself? And when you hear, the minister speak, what are you thinking?
Well, I think that really the SIU, this is sort of missing the point. And I want to say from the outset, that the vast majority of police officers are doing a great job out there. They're doing a tough job. But there is not a serious minority of police officers who are bad actors. And we see them at demonstrations like the G7. We see them when they're spraying pepper spray in the kids' faces. We see them, when they're dressed as the Black Wall of Death. And this is very frightening to the public. Okay, we've gone from sharing to Andy.
So when you refer to that, I mean, some people may be thinking, well, they don't self-assign their uniform. They're part of a tactical team or something. That's what they're issued to wear.
Well, I realize that, but what I was saying is this is sort of a broad reason from a public perspective. This is what we're seeing, and the media tends to highlight this in news reports when there's Occupy Wall Street or something, or the yellow vest. You see the tear gas being thrown, you see the shields up, and this is very scary to people, and it makes you feel that the police are unapproachable, and that's not a good situation. I
wonder, is that how you feel? Because maybe some people, they would never go to a protest. Some people might see those same images and say, oh, those are people who want to fight, and they, if you're riled up, they provide a target for their anger, frustration about everything, and that role that you described is something to lash out against.
Well, as I said, this is always a quality judgment at the time of the scene, right? I mean, I know you watch the Yellow Vest protests in France there, and you can see that the people are setting fires to cars, and those people should not be there. But you see the vast majority of people just walking, down the street, trying to protest the government, legislation or what have you. But, I think that the changes at the SIU are not going to change the situation, because good cops are always good, and as a lawyer told me, bad cops are always bad, and it's weeding out. It's when you find that bad cop has to go.
Actually, I should ask one of our guests, because there is an aspect of this about giving police chiefs the discretion. I don't know how far it goes to actually dismiss officers. This has been something that has bothered chiefs. For a long time. Let's say there's someone who's disciplined, they're even found guilty of discreditable conduct, but they can't be removed necessarily from the police force, and they certainly stay with pay. Who wants to jump in? Just one of you, because Davin Charney, do you want to speak to this? Does this,
sure.
Can police chiefs, if there's a bad apple, do they get to assess if someone loses their job?
Well, this is one of the things that really outraged the public, or has continued to outrage the public, is that police officers who are suspended and have been charged with serious criminal offenses, like Forcillo, who shot Sammy Yatim, or other officers, that they can drag out the procedure, which ends in them being fired, and that procedure can go on for 2, 3, sometimes as long as 8 or 10 years, and they're going to be, and that the chiefs of police did not have the discretion to cut their salary in that time. So an officer could be getting paid their full salary. Half of officers earn over $100,000 a year, and they would get that salary while they're sitting at home and being suspended from their work.
This is where it gets tricky, though. A lot of people might get suspended from their work, and until there's something resolved, they would still get their pay. It's not an automatic cutoff.
Rita, may I interject at this point?
Go ahead, briefly.
I think Davin will be heartened to learn that in the new legislation, sections 210 talks about suspension without pay. So it gives the chief of police power to suspend an officer without pay when they're charged with a serious offense, as defined under the law of Canada, or they're out on bail conditions that make it impossible for them to do their job. And so the provision is in the legislation for officers to be suspended without pay.
Okay, Davin Charney, is that your interpretation of this legislation as well?
Yes, and the previous Liberal government had put that in, and the current government has kept that.
Okay, Steve, you're next. You're in Mississauga. Are you a police officer by chance?
No, I'm not, but I'm a big supporter of the police. I'm from the Black community. I've been here for around 1976, and 90% of the interaction I've had with police have been positive. I normally shake the police officer's hand and tell him that you're doing a good job, and I respect and I love what you're doing. Because these guys, people don't have the imagination to understand what it's like to be a police. Every day you're in a life and death situation. You got to make a decision whether or not you're going to go home at night. It's up to you. I want my police officer to go home every night. He's taking care of the bad guys out there that's protecting my family and my safety. We live in one of the safest cities in the world, and I commend our police force 100%.
So can I ask you something? Yeah, because when you say 97% of the time, like I don't.
90%.
Yeah, but so where are you meeting these police officers? I don't meet this many police officers. Where are you meeting them?
I said 90% of my interactions.
Right, like so. Where are you meeting them? Where are you meeting them?
Your traffic stops. You meet them if you have a broken taillight. You know, you say you go through a red light. You meet them. Say you've been driving too fast. You meet them. You meet them in traffic. When I was younger, one stopped me on the road. You meet them, right? This is
well, no, I'm asking because you know why I'm asking because you've identified yourself as a black man, and this has been an issue, right? Like I can't tell you, I don't have that many. I've not in my life had that many interactions with police.
You never had a speeding ticket?
Oh yeah, but that's about it. That's why I'm asking you. So what happened with the 10% of time that they didn't go so well?
Yeah, but unfortunately, there are a lot of young black men committing crimes, and I understand when they treat me as a suspect because you hear about it every single day. I totally understand it. And they come at me with any sort of attitude, I totally understand it because I look like a suspect, right?
Why? Why would you say you look like a suspect?
Oh my goodness!
Well, because at the time I'm a young black man, and young black man just finished murdering another young black man. The police might think I look like him. It's just a thing.
Goodness.
I totally understand that. And he talks to me for 2 seconds, he realizes it's not me. We shake hands and we have a good time. Right? I've never really had a bad experience. They don't have an easy job. Nobody understands that. They're always attacking the police. Thank you, Mr. Ford, for giving the police some respect. I have big respect for the police, and that's my attitude.
That's going to be our last word. And it's a bit of a, it's too bad maybe you didn't say that at the beginning, because you know what? The phone lines and Twitter are going to go crazy. But you can give your number to our producer. I want to thank both our guests, Davin Charney, who's a lawyer in Toronto, and Greg Brown, who spent 28 years with the Ottawa Police Service. He's now a postdoctoral research fellow at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto. We're going to post this like we do for all our programs, cbc.ca/Ontario Today. And may I say, because those of you who we got piles of emails, piles of tweets, all week, whether we were talking about Jody Wilson-Raybould, yesterday it was about the truck convoy. We're taking a break from all this heavy stuff, and we're bringing in a researcher to talk about the benefits of singing. So, for us and for you, a softer way perhaps to round out the week. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
Hi, this is Grant Lawrence from CBC Music. Searchlight, the hunt for Canada's next great musical act is on. It's time to vote. The stakes are huge. The Searchlight winner gets a spot in Canada's premier artist development program, the Alan Slate Juno Masterclass, a recording residency at the National Music Centre, a performance slot at the 2019 CBC Music Festival, and more. Vote now at cbcmusic.ca/searchlight.
The National Research Council official time signal. The beginning of the long dash indicates exactly 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This is CBC News. Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock and 2 degrees with light snow falling in Ottawa. I'm Lawrence Wall from the CBC Ottawa newsroom. Ontario's police watchdog will not be laying charges after a high-speed chase last March ended with the death of an 88-year-old woman. The SIU says OPP were justified in chasing after the SUV as it traveled at speeds of 140 kilometers an hour and faster. The 42-year-old driver is facing several charges, including first-degree murder and flight from police causing death. Florence Wyatt Morris was killed in the head-on crash on County Road 2 east of Bakerside Road near Napanee. The SIU notes that the officers did not have enough time to try tactics such as blocking roads or laying down a spike belt. The
The Commons Justice Committee has opened a hearing into the SNC-Lavalin affair. It's investigating allegations that the former Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, was pressured by the Prime Minister's office not to prosecute the Quebec engineering firm. The Justice Minister, David Lametti, outlined what he can and cannot discuss as he appeared before the committee. This was an exchange between Lametti and a member of the committee, the Conservative MP, Lisa Raitt.
Globe and Mail's reporting that there's a cabinet meeting. I'm not going to ask you about the contents of the cabinet meeting. It's more of a hypothetical. Pretend you're the Attorney General, as you are. You're sitting in a cabinet meeting where a former Attorney General alleges that there was improper influence on her at that time. As the current Attorney General, do you have an obligation to resign?
I am going to rely on cabinet conference. Cabinet.
Not asking about what happened, but in order to uphold the justice in the country, do you not have an obligation to resign?
Ms. Ray, time is exceeded. I'll give Mr. Lametti a chance to answer the question, and then we'll move to the next questioner.
And to answer that question as a result of cabinet confidentiality, on the basis of cabinet confidentiality.
The Prime Minister told reporters in Halifax this morning that he is still disappointed by Wilson-Raybould's decision to resign from the cabinet. The Ontario government has ordered Hydro One not to pay its CEO any more than $1.5 million a year. The utility and the government have been at odds for weeks over executive compensation. Hydro One has refused repeated requests to slash the pay. The Energy Minister, Greg Rickford, says he's issued a formal directive to cap the CEO compensation. Hydro One was asking for $2.8 million to attract and retain highly qualified leadership. Radio-Canada has learned that dozens of SQ officers assigned to the G7 summit protest last June in Quebec were paid time and a half. The officers were called in to work overtime at the protest in La Malbaie and Quebec City after taking vacation time. Ian Lafreniere is a CAQ member and a former police officer. He says he won't give his opinion until he knows more.
I won't judge about the appearance. I need facts, I need details, so I'll wait for the SQ to get those details.
The Liberals were in power at the time. The interim leader, Pierre Arcan, says it's easy to criticize how things were planned in hindsight.
So I think that in this particular case, I don't think you can blame the government at the time for trying to make sure that things go smoothly.
The federal government announced the dates for the G7 summit in May of 2017, but the SQ says it can't block people's vacation requests. Pope Francis is presiding at a historic summit at the Vatican. For the next 4 days, 200 senior members of the Catholic Church will be discussing child sexual abuse by clergy. Megan Williams has more from Rome.
In a small auditorium dotted with the purple and red caps of bishops and cardinals, a somber Pope Francis reminded the nearly all-male, gray-haired group why they are here. With the scourge of sexual abuse perpetrated by the men of the church, he said, I've called you here to listen to the cries of the little ones asking for justice.
And that was the CBC's Megan Williams reporting. For news updated through the day and night, stay tuned to CBC Radio 1 and go to our website, cbc.ca/Ottawa. And that was the CBC News. The weather for Ottawa and the region, cloudy today, 40% chance of flurries, west wind gusting to 50 at the high of 1. Right now in Ottawa, light snow, 2 degrees, Kingston 3, Pembroke 2, Cornwall 3, Maniwaki -1, Belleville 3. Again in Ottawa, 2 degrees.
Can the Catholic Church root out abusers and keep them out of the clergy? It's one of the questions Catholic bishops are asking in Rome this week at their 4-day summit. We'll talk about that today on All in a Day. Plus, singer-songwriter Kate Weeks' new album, and Di Golding and Tish Chambers review Isn't It Romantic? And Alita Battle Angel. That and more coming up on All in a Day from 3 to 6 on CBC Radio 1.
How many of you find yourself bringing the best of you to work and the leftovers home? I often say, if you could be as charming with your partner and as attentive and as focused and as present as you are with your customers, your marriage would be doing much better. I mean, basically, there is a way in which there is a kind of a laisser-aller, you let go. You come home, you take off your nice clothes, you sit in that couch, you chill, you feel like you've put all the efforts out to be in the world. But then don't come complaining that you want some fire.
a spark, some kind of meaningful connection, whether that's between partners or in relationships with friends, family, colleagues. Because as Esther Perel often says, the quality of our relationships of all kinds determines the quality of our lives. And the data backs her up. Studies routinely find that strong relationships make us happier, healthier, and can even prolong our lives. But at the same time, loneliness is cutting across generations, hurting our health, and some call its rise an epidemic. So where does that all leave us? I'm Pia Chattopadhyay. Today on Out in the Open, we're probing this thing we all struggle with, connection, in a wide-ranging conversation with Esther Perel. Esther's a Belgian psychotherapist who lives in the United States. She's made it her mission to help us connect better. And when Esther talks, people listen. Lots of people. Esther's books have been translated into tens of languages. Her TED Talks have been viewed tens of millions of times. And her podcast, Where Should We Begin?, which lets you be a fly on the wall in her therapy sessions, mainly with couples, well, it's been called a public service. You'll hear why a little later on. But first, let's start with getting to know who this relationship lodestar is a little better. Esther, yes, my name is Sia, first of all.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I just heard you asking, what the heck am I doing? So
No, I didn't say it like that. I said, tell me more. I know some, but what details am I missing?
I'm going to tell you right now. First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you. Esther, we're going to spend our conversation today talking about connection, from the most intimate between couples to connection on a much larger cultural and political scales. But I do think it's important to first establish a connection between our listeners and you. How does it feel to be the human in pop culture who people seem to think has human relationships all figured out?
But the emperor has no clothes. I mean, it's how it feels. It feels awesome. It feels a big responsibility. It feels like it means that there is really many important and difficult conversations in the relational space that need to be held at this moment. And, you know, it's a life project, basically. I've studied relationships pretty much across cultures. Then I looked at what happens in mixed marriages, in racial, cultural, religiously mixed families. Then I looked at what happens when the political regime changes, when communism falls and societies move from a collectivist, more agrarian system to a consumer-oriented society, a more individualistic one. And then lately what happens with the digital revolution. So it's an endless topic, and when people get interested in it, I never tire to talk about it with them.
And so if this is, somewhat of a personal mission in terms of improving how we relate to one another, to each other, what is it about you? Like, what is it about Esther Perel that drives you to want to dig into this stuff and help us all get better at it?
It's a combination of things, right? My own background, my parents are both concentration camp survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, and they were the sole survivors of their whole family. And so the loss of relationships, the loss of connection, but also the unique moments of connection of people that helped them in situations where they thought nobody would ever help them, evil, altruism, empathy. All of these major relational dynamics were pretty much part of stories that I heard from the moment I grew up. So the existence of relationships, the importance of them, the fact that my parents had nobody. So how do you create new relationships? How do you trust again? How do you laugh again with others? How do you love again when you know that you can lose everything you've ever loved, etc., etc.? I think it just came with mother's milk, this deep interest in the human condition, and in particular in the relational life of human beings.
And as you have just said, your parents, they were the only two out of each of their families that survived the Holocaust. And you describe them
as choosing post-war, not just to survive, but to thrive. And so for you as a little girl, a young child growing up in that environment, what did thriving look like in your household?
It meant it's a set of issues, that when you live with people who have overcome that which seems impossible to overcome, you become very modest in your ability to think that you have any legitimacy to whatever difficulties or problems or woes or worries you may have. There's a kind of a way in which you kind of say, how does that compare to Auschwitz? And then it's like, I'm hungry, but I'm not as hungry as those people were. I'm cold, but I'm not the one walking with newspaper around my feet. I'm sad, but I haven't lost anybody. So it kind of creates a situation where you have to struggle for the legitimacy that your little boo-boos are still worthy.
And did that make it difficult for you to connect with your parents?
Not really on that level. I think that what was in my house was that you couldn't really be sad very long. If you were sad, somebody would say, "What's up?" And I don't think my parents meant it as, your problems are not worthy of attention. It's just that there was a real sense that you fight all the time, even if you don't feel like it, actually. You fake it till you feel it. Partly because I think my parents had the concept that when you are vulnerable, when you let go, when you give up, when you are weak, when you are sad, that means that you are going to die. I mean, in the camps, the vulnerable died. So there was a sense that you had to be strong, assertive, affirmative, engaged with life. And they lived like that. I would say if there was a taboo, it was the taboo of being sad in some way. Not that they didn't have sadness and feelings, but it was clearly the encouragement was in the other direction. What my parents and many people have understood, but they understood it without science and without modern psychology coming behind them, was that you heal in community, you heal in connection. So my parents had groups of survivors of these camps, groups of survivors of those villages, people who came together to celebrate holidays, commemorations. They would talk to anybody, just people on the street, customers who would come into their shop, and they had no shame about what they had gone through. They were proud of it, of having survived it, and they would often say to us, "You have no idea what we went through. Those were such hard years." But it's not like they were overwhelming people, but it was like their story. And now I think, my God, I work with so many people who've undergone trauma and who are so ashamed and so mired in silence and in secrecy and would never talk about it. And I realized there was such an ease about it for my parents. It made it very much easier for their children, for sure.
You have pinpointed community and connection as key factors in their decision to grab all they could from life, which is so interesting because it would be so easy for people in their shoes to not do any of that. How did they do that? How did they grab on to community and connection?
Yael Danieli, who's a famous researcher on Holocaust families, talks about how among the people who spoke and who told of their experiences, there often was the group of people that highlighted the victimization and the group of people who highlighted their fighting. When you had stories, which my parents were, and I don't think it's neatly two categories like that, but it makes sense to me. My parents had a way of telling stories that were about how they managed, how they overcame, how they found another piece of bread, how they found a box of potatoes. I mean, it was really fighters' stories. And I think that fighting mentality was something that gave them a zest for life. And in some way, they didn't really experience an enormous amount of survivor guilt. They actually experienced an enormous sense that because they were still there, they had to rebuild. Their children were going to not just be a symbol of survival, but also a symbol of revival. They were going to recreate the community and perpetuate their rituals and their traditions and their culture and their religion. And so they were a little bit on a mission. I think that I have described that in Antwerp, in the community where I grew up, I remember noticing two very different energetic realities in people's homes, in my friends, because we were all children of survivors. So in that sense, I wasn't alone with that experience. And I remember thinking, these people, they did not die. But those people, they seem to have come back to life. And what makes one or the other is a set of issues. It has to do with who people were before their traumatic experiences, what happened to them during their camp years or their hiding years, who else survived, how did they lose the people that were dear to them, who did they meet afterwards, what kind of marriages did they have afterwards. So I think it's actually multi-determined, the extent to which some people are able once again to thrive, to experience the erotic as an antidote to death, to kind of come back to life, to enjoy, to savor life at its fullest, and how much others remain more tethered to the ground, it's in a state of vigilance, not trusting, unable to really enjoy, not able to experience much pleasure, because when you experience pleasure, you're obviously not on guard. So if you live all the time on guard, you can't let go. And you know, I'd never formulated it so concretely growing up. I knew the girlfriends and the friends from school, and I felt it in their homes. And I also knew that there was a real draw of a lot of my friends to want to spend a lot of time in my home.
And so with that backdrop, with that lived experience, with all of that as context, Esther Perel, you often say that meaningful relationships are central to our quality of life. Why?
Because I think that we are creatures of meaning. We want to wake up in the morning and feel that we have a reason to be there, and that we exist in the hearts and the minds of others who, even when they're not there, carry us inside of them, so that we can experience the constancy of our attachment and our connection. Because I read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, very early, and it made perfect sense. Even when you don't care about you, if you care about others, it gives you a connection and a purpose and something, self-transcendence is the way he calls it, something bigger than you. And I think that meaning is what leads to happiness, and not happiness is what gives us meaning.
And what does having a truly meaningful connection with someone look like?
It means you feel that you matter, first of all, and they matter. You matter. And if you matter, it means that someone is thinking of you, someone cares for you, someone remembers you. You exist in the memory of others. You know, we live in stories. You are part of another person's story. It means that you can never hit the ground because you are lifted by these multiple connections who hold you up, literally. Literally, physically, they hold you up as well, of course, as psychologically. That you are not alone on this world, which I think is foundational to our human experience, is that we probably don't survive well alone. Now, we have different needs of connection. Not everybody has the need for many. Some of us live with 2 or 3 very close friends, and it's plenty. It's not about the number, but it is about the psychic, psychological, and I would say ontological meaning of what relationships provide in people's lives and what the absence of those kinds of relationships provide in people's lives.
So when you look at your own life, Esther Perel's own life in her own head, what's an example of a meaningful relationship from your own life?
I mean, definitely my relationship with my husband, and also my relationship with my sons, and I have friends. You know, I will answer you. I celebrated my 60th birthday this year. I had people who came from every decade of my life, including the friends of my children who know me since they're born, some of them. And I did this beautiful exercise. A friend of mine did this exercise, Priya Parker, and she asked people to step forward if they knew me from the age of 0 to 10, and then 10 to 20, and all the way up to 60. And it was a testimony to who I was, to what I have done, to who I have brought together, to how every generation of my life had a piece of the story, and together they were weaving together a tapestry. And the sense also of how people probably would remember me afterwards. It was extremely affirming for me because I have lived in various countries and I could have had a story of disruption and interruptions, a fragmented history. But what I had was a story that was made up of multiple pieces that actually came together. People flew in from everywhere, and it it's extremely affirming to feel that you are a part like that in other people's lives as much as they also are a part of my life. And I realized, seriously, I thought for a moment, if I have to go early, I've had a full life.
All right, so that's Esther Perel's case for why relationships matter so much. She's also part of the chorus that's called Loneliness, a Public Health Issue. So what do we get so wrong about relationships? What keeps us apart? Let's try to find some answers to those questions, starting in the realm Esther has become so well known for, couples.
We want, with the same person, to experience security and adventure, stability and change, dependability and surprise. We want this person to be what we always expected from traditional marriage, a companion, family life, economic support, social status. And we want the same person to still be our best friend and our trusted confidant and our passionate lover to boot. And we live twice as long. We really have this idea that one person today will give us what once an entire village used to provide. I can't say it more concretely. Such unprecedented expectations for our romantic relationships. They have become the new religion. Instead of seeing our partner and our relationship, our intimate relationship, as primary, but it exists in an ecology of many other relationships that also nurture us and that we nurture.
And layered within that is so much choice nowadays, right? I read something where you said, one of the kind of obvious ones is, do we want to have children? Yes or no? Okay, we figure that out. Then how many do we have? When do we want to have them? What do we want to do before or after we have children? That there is sort of this cornucopia of choice that is somewhat making it all a little more difficult.
Relationships used to be organized around duty and obligation. Today they are organized around negotiation and conversation. So what you have is much more choice, more options, more self-expression, but it comes with a lot less clarity and a lot more uncertainty and a lot more self-doubt. And so the burdens of the self have never been heavier because all these decisions, the big decisions used to be made for us. And today we have to make them, and we also want a level of certainty about them that is often quite crippling. But this is the world we live in the West.
If we are putting all of these expectations, this pressure on oneself, ourselves, but in addition to that, one person having to deliver for me, how does it get in the way of connecting with one another, all of that pressure?
Look, it is the golden question, right? Why is love so difficult? Because people come with a history. And they come with a history around attachment, around trust, around respect, around gender, around their bodies. People come either having experienced too much attention or too little attention. Each person comes with their relational dowry through their relationship, seriously. And then they have expectations that with you, I am never going to feel that way anymore. I'm never going to feel alone. I'm never going to have to worry about being abandoned. I'm never going to be suffocated. I'm going to be loved as is. I mean, there is an enormous mythology over this person that's going to basically rid me of all my internal turmoils. That projection, that you owe me this, and especially because in the beginning I felt this way since we now have the love-based marriage. When that then goes away, then it's replaced with tremendous resentment. How dare you abandon me? How dare you leave me feeling that I'm not important, that I don't matter? You used to once be so centered around me. You used to pay attention to me. You used to lavish me. And now it's pure neglect. How dare you? Or the reverse. Obviously, that's what I deserve. I don't deserve any more. That's all I can get. That's what my life is about. It covers a range of responses, but that sense of disillusionment that comes from what one expects one will feel by finding one's soulmate, if you want, one and only, is part of what makes it so difficult. And then I think there's the addition that we do experience more pressure today on this nuclear system, which is one system that works for some, doesn't work for many. But interestingly, when it comes to if we want to call it marriage or committed relationships, we have not been very creative in coming up with more than one model. I mean, just about every other system, every company, we have many, many models. But when it comes to our love lives, we are rather unimaginative, I would say.
If one of the ways we set ourselves up for quote-unquote failures through this idea of unrealistic expectations, and another way society says we damage connection is through cheating, you do not see infidelity as a moral issue or as one of victim and transgressor. What do you see it as?
No, I do see it as a transgression, absolutely. I see it as a relational hurt. I don't necessarily see it in moral terms, necessarily. I understand relational betrayal, and I understand that relational betrayal comes in many forms, and sometimes neglect and indifference and violence and contempt by people who have not cheated does not make them morally superior. That's what I'm trying to sometimes take on, is that we have a way of putting cheating as a kind of on the hierarchy of betrayals, as if other people's behavior, as long as they have not strayed, can remain commendable. And that maybe is a moral hierarchy that I don't necessarily agree with. That doesn't mean I justify, condone, or encourage cheating or infidelity whatsoever. But I have studied infidelity for the last 12 years now. Never has it been easier to cheat. Never has it been more difficult to keep a secret. Never have we relied more on one person to remain loyal to us to the degree that we need to, given everything we just talked about. And never have we been more encouraged to stray, because we live in the era where we feel entitled to be happy. And all of these things combined make infidelity an extremely useful window to study modern human connections. That's why I got interested in infidelity.
I'm sure you get a lot of people saying, "Oh, Esther, you got it all figured out. Look at your 30-year marriage; it's perfect." And they sort of idealize you. You may be the ideal, but was a younger Esther susceptible to the kinds of things that you speak of? So susceptible to those unrealistic notions of romantic love that you're describing?
Absolutely. Yes, I grew up with the same in the same environment. Definitely, there was this idea of the person you're going to meet and how he is going to make me feel. In my case, it was a he. How he will make me feel, and how let down I felt when I still felt bad, as if he was responsible to my well-being at that level. And now I did not necessarily understand that certain things I have to take responsibility for. They're mine. If he can help me, that's nice, but he doesn't owe me. He's not my mother or my father, etc., etc. You know, there is a beautiful word that we don't hear enough these days. It's called maturity. You know, at some point you learn certain things. My relationship, it went through all kinds of cycles. You know, I once came up with that sentence that ended up in the TED Talk, where I said, you know, many of us will have 2 or 3 relationships in our adult lives, and some of us will do it with the same person. So I have done it with the same person. I've had 3 marriages probably with the same husband. But the relationship is different. The dynamic, the power distribution, the complementarity, the things that are at the center of our concerns at that moment, etc. And sometimes they follow the developmental arc of family life. And sometimes they have to do with an ability to create that balance between separateness and togetherness, between freedom and commitment.
We need to put this conversation on hold for just a moment. We'll pick it up after a quick break. I'm Pia Chattopadhyay. There's more out in the open, just around the corner.
This is a CBC News Update. It's 1:30 and 2 degrees in Ottawa. I'm Lawrence Wall from the CBC Ottawa newsroom. Police in Belleville have identified the victim after a man died yesterday afternoon after a fight. 23-year-old Nicholas Wilson of London, Ontario, was pronounced dead at the scene. Police and paramedics were called to a home after a report that a man had been injured in a fight and was in medical distress. The federal government is taking steps to reunite a Syrian refugee with family members overseas. It follows a house fire in Halifax that killed her 7 children and left her husband badly burned. The Prime Minister says his
government is looking at what can be done to give the Halifax family some solace in a time of tragedy. And the federal NDP is losing another incumbent. This time, the Quebec MP Marjolaine Boutin-Sweet says she will not be seeking re-election later this year. More news at 2 here on Radio 1.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian Black. Here's the fourth.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi. It's half an hour after the show. Why are you still waiting?
Well, I'm a very stubborn person, and I thought let's see what they're going to tell me after being on hold for an hour and a half.
Well, you know what? I juggle a lot of calls, and I can't get everybody on the air. I have half a million listeners,
I totally
appreciate your patience.
I totally appreciate that. You said you're going to.
Sorry, I just finished up on the show. Sorry,
you said you were going to tweet the link for the so-called new legislative changes, but I haven't seen it.
Thank you for reminding me.
We're all tweeting about this right now. The irony of so many police-involved people calling in. And the whole context of the show seemed to be lost. It was supposed to be about police oversight, and it seemed to turn to something else, which is exactly what this government has done in its own narrative. So we're concerned with what CBC...
The anti-police attitudes, that thing?
No, I'm sorry?
Sorry, that's what the government wants us to think it was. That it's all about anti-police attitudes. Sorry.
No, I'm saying your show today failed to... portray what I thought it was going to talk about was the SIU and police oversight and the changes in legislation. It actually allowed the narrative to be changed by people calling in, talking about how wonderful the police are. This doesn't make any sense. That has nothing to do with police oversight. And it literally failed the listeners. We're tweeting all about this right now on Twitter, saying, what's going on, CBC Ontario Today? You know?
Okay.
And so I said, you know what? I've been on hold right from the beginning. I told them what I wanted to mention. So everybody started laughing because we know that it is as if the truth does not want to be shared, heard, or discussed. What is going on with the program?
Well, I was trying to get a balance of calls. I agree that I don't think we went into a whole lot of depth on that legislation. I had a police officer who spent the night, read 300 pages of legislation last night so that he could do that. And I know that Davin Charney was doing his homework last night as well. So that was the point that they were on to do that. But I think I agree with you that the calls distracted from that.
Well, it really is the host's responsibility to keep focus, right? And so this is where we're saying, hey, CBC, what's going on? You have a responsibility, or at least we think you do, in relation to how you make sure that you stay on topic. And let's get to that topic. And he never really got there. It was kind of like a waste of my time. So I said, you know what? My time's wasted. I'm going to hold and see if anybody comes back, which you did, and tells me what happened today, because it was kind of strange. What's your name?
My name is Margot Wright. I produce the program.
Margot, you're the one I wanted to talk to, because I was going to ask the producer.
I can't talk long.
No, but you are the producer of the show. You're the producer, right? And so even as the producer, you know who you're letting on the line. You also know that you're going to send a cue to the host and say, okay, we're off topic. Let's move on. And none of that seemed to happen. My background is in film and television, so I'm aware of what can be done to ensure that you stay on topic and make sure that you get to what you're trying to tell. And when I called prior to your show starting, I actually called a half an hour earlier just to see if I could speak to you, but someone picked up and then just didn't respond.
I'm not in studio half an hour beforehand.
But what I wanted to ask, what was the premise supposed to be?
It was to try to understand this legislation better and get a sense from our callers, so analysis of the legislation, and get a sense from our callers about whether they felt that the Ford government was going in the right direction or not.
Mm-hmm. And we lost that. It didn't seem to come out. People were talking about...
I've had some of this conversation with Rita already. We weren't happy with exactly how it turned out. So, yeah.
So, but you say so, but then what do you do when it doesn't do what your objective was?
I'm going to go to the newsroom right now because I think there are some follows to do.
No, but when you do a follow, is it that you're saying that you're going to actually do another program and this time?
No, I'm not doing another program about the SIU. Not right now. I'm not planning one right now. But I do think that, I know which reporter I'm going to approach and pitch a story to, but, that's a process.
Because I think what happens, Rita, sorry, did you say your name is
Margot.
Rita? Sorry, Margot.
No, Margot.
Margot, my apologies. The problem, Margot, is that you take up people's time. Literally, CBC is a public broadcaster. So we're all paying attention to find out what is going to be said because we're not sure of what is going to be said. And then it's garbage, which is what people are tweeting. It's garbage. And then you don't come back with a follow-up to apologize about the show. You just leave it at that. Yet you have a responsibility to the listener as the public broadcaster to say, hey, you know what? We let that go. We failed to do what our objectives were, and we apologize. Some kind of public acknowledgement about how horribly wrong the program went. I think that's something that you as the producer should do, because it just really wastes people's time. And here I am. I happen to be sick, so that's why I said I have all day to be on hold. I actually was loving Pia's program too. It kind of connected with yours. It's about connection. And when there is such an egregious connection in society where we allow institutions to usurp the power of the people, that is a problem. And you as an institution yourself, as a broadcaster, not rightly disseminating information is problematic because it only adds to the problems and it compounds it.
Well, I will certainly go back and have a listen to it and have a sense of whether and have a conversation again with Rita about. You're describing it as a failure and something that requires an apology. That's pretty big. So I don't know that we failed to that.
To meet the objective, did you not think the show failed in meeting its objectives that you described to me?
I think that the caller is distracted from the ability to analyze the legislation. Yes.
But that is the responsibility of the host, is it not? And
no, part of it has got to do with the format of the program, right? Format of the program is, we could have spent an hour just talking to these two guys. That would have been analysis. Right? That would have been analysis.
Not really, because if you don't have an expert, what kind of analysis is it that there's somebody that you don't really know if
No,
they're
there are two people who sat down and read that legislation. I didn't read 300 pages of legislation.
No, but you're saying that you're going to put on the onus on, for example, Mr. Brown, who didn't sound like he was very knowledgeable and was just only speaking one side, whereas Davin Charney is actually an experienced lawyer dealing with facts, right? So you're telling me you just get.
I wouldn't say that Greg Brown is not well informed.
When you guys were talking with him, I'm sure I heard it said retired police. Oh no, not retired. And you guys didn't even know what his position was, what his background was. I thought, what am I listening to?
If Rita said that's because she wasn't well prepared then, because it's all in the background. I know what his background is.
What is his background?
He's a Fulbright scholar. He is an Osgood Law researcher, and he spent nearly 30 years as a police officer. He's a consultant to all kinds of police departments all across North America. He teaches at Carleton and he teaches at Memorial University.
Okay, but
he's not a lightweight.
Well, he certainly came across as such by the things that he said.
No, I would certainly say he's biased, and I will also say that Davin comes with his own bias.
Well, I think the problem always is turning up right now in society, in particular with media, which is where we get this false reporting of information. I think the problem exists is that you always think that there needs to be a two-sided perspective when it comes to institutions. Institutions are accountable to the public. So why do you think it's necessary to get the institution to be speaking of how lesser accountability is a good thing? That doesn't even make sense. The reality is you should be looking at, and I feel that I'm maybe offending you, so I just want to first preface it by saying I'm not intending to offend you in any way. I'm just making a statement with regards to the fact that if you're going to look at it, accountability of institutions, including the CBC, policing, and police oversight, all requires the perspective of experts within or people with lived experience from the public. That is who everyone is accountable to. So when we always go to this
and so we had people coming on we had callers who had been beaten up by the police. We had a caller who had complained to the SIU.
I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about your experts that you had on. That's what I'm talking about.
And they had lived experience, both of them.
No, okay. I think you understood what I was saying.
Charney did, and so does Greg.
I think you understood what I was saying. When it comes to accountability in institutions, trying to balance it by saying there's two sides of a story coming from an institutional perspective never holds a weight when it goes to accountability. If an institution starts with the fact of saying that we need less accountability, you already know that there's no integrity there. Institutions are accountable to the public, so it doesn't always have to be this both sides, such a way of.
You're right. We probably didn't need two guests, but you know what? I feel like we're going around in circles, and I've been at this. I haven't had a break since 8:30 this morning.
I want you to get your break, Margo.
I appreciate you.
And I'm looking for your tweet with the link.
I will certainly go and have a listen to the show, and we will talk about it again with Rita and I. And I appreciate your feedback.
Well,
but I'm gonna wrap this up.
I look forward to your link showing where this so-called legislation is, because nobody's been consulted in the public. And I also look forward to an apology with regards to taking up people's time for an hour today to be so off topic.
An apology because this show was a failure. You want me to apologize because this show was a failure?
Well, when you listened to it and I asked you the question, did you think you met your objective, and you said no? Well, then that would mean you failed to do what you were proposing to do. Right? You allowed it to run away like a wild train. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about accountability to the public. When you ask us to listen in and also ask us to pay for the public broadcaster, we're expecting something that's actually profitable of our time.
I don't know what to say. I don't think that the show was that much of a failure. I told you I will go back and have a listen to it.
Well, look at the tweets that are being tweeted.
That's all I can commit to at this point.
Look at the tweets that are tweeted, and then you'll understand.
Okay. Fair enough.
All right,
I'm going to hang
Margo.
up now.
You take care. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.